welcome to Bible Bits, Matthew chapter 10. In chapters 5 through 9, we've gotten a good kind of taste of Jesus' ministry, both his preaching, the kinds of holistic salvation as well that he comes to provide. He's not just a teacher, nor is he just a physician, and we know he's got a purpose too. It's not just a job for Jesus. He's come to bring about a kingdom, to bring salvation. We've heard how he has come to do something new. In this chapter, we'll see how new that really is, although he also has clearly come as Israel's God, which is why he picks 12 men as his apostles. It's that number 12 is significant. Just like we had the 12 tribes of Israel, so too there are now 12 apostles. But that as we think about the apostles in comparison to the 12 tribes of Israel, there's also some really noteworthy differences that help us highlight the different kind of ministry and kingdom that this is really. First of all, the disciples are, on the whole, they are not brothers. There are brothers among them, but they're not all from one family. And I think we don't even know if Jesus was himself loosely related to any of them, and yet he is clearly the patriarch, even though none of these are his children, and they may not even be his relatives. If they are, which it's possible some of them are, it's not noteworthy. It's not important. That's not what makes them his. This new Israel is not their lineage or their relationship, genetic relationship to Jesus. It's something else. In fact, regarding families, Jesus warns them that families will be torn apart on account of Jesus' coming. And plus he gives them this very serious, dire warning that if any of them are to love their family more than Jesus, then they are not worthy of him. Secondly, they have a different kind of objective in mind, a different goal, a different destination than Israel did. They don't come to claim any sort of physical inheritance because Jesus is sending them out. This is clearly the mission. They're being sent out, but they're supposed to go to all of Israel, but they're not trying to claim any land. If they're claiming anything, it's a question of claiming of hearts. If someone is to reject them, they are not to try to conquer them or overpower them or force them, but they're just supposed to shake the dust off their feet and move on. They're, again, not searching for any sort of physical possessions. They take nothing with them. They're explicitly commanded not to take anything with them, but instead they are to go and the people will receive them, and if they don't, then they're to move on. If they receive them, they're taken care of, and if they're not, then they are to move on. Which is similar in some ways. Now, I'm kind of focusing on the difference, but it's similar to how Israel walks with Yahweh in the Old Testament too. I mean, they walk across the Red Sea. They got the biggest victory in the history of Israel. Multiple, if you had to pick their top 5 victories, they're all like not done by Israel really at all. They walk across the Red Sea. All they did is they walked, and somehow they won. The Red Sea closes over Pharaoh and his mighty army, one of the greatest armies in the history of the world. They go against one of the greatest fortresses in the world, and what do they do again? Well, they just walk around the city 7 times. And even David, they got the greatest man against the world, and how did they beat him? Well, it's not any great warrior. It's a boy, an adolescent maybe. He's got a stone in his sling. I mean, it's none of these things are by Israel's strength or might. It would look like complete luck if you didn't know the true story. Like historians would probably be scratching their heads trying to come up with theories as to how in the world Israel survived these things if they were close enough to see some of the effects. So that part's kind of similar. But unlike, another difference, Moses and Joshua marching, they are not guaranteed a military victory. In fact, again, it's kind of the opposite. They're warned that they're being sent out as sheep among wolves. They're going to be arrested, betrayed, and even reviled sometimes by those to whom they preach. And yet, despite how the ops on this look, they are doing exactly what they should be doing, and the kingdom is growing and expanding. They're going to preach And yes, they're going to be rejected by some, but they are not to be afraid. Those who receive, to those who receive the message will in fact be rewarded. This is a different kind of testament or kingdom or people that God that Jesus warned would, to reiterate from old chapters, would burst the old ways like new wine put into old wineskins. It doesn't fit, even God's kingdom doesn't fit into the categories and into the prepared kind of ways of doing things. And I think that still is true of the gospel today. You can't force it into old categories, and sometimes Christians may make the mistake of trying to turn something, make it Christian, but this, Christianity, the kingdom of God can't be packaged and sold and, rebranded or whatever, it's its own thing. And it sort of seems weird as we think about that, another kind of oddity, or maybe it even seems wrong. Jesus gives these instructions and he tells them only to go to the lost sheep of Israel, not to go to Samaria, not to go to the Gentiles, and that kind of seems like counterintuitive to us Christians. But I think it makes sense when we consider that what God has wanted and always has wanted is relationships. He made promises to Israel, even though they did nothing to earn those promises, even though they broke the covenant in every possible way, but God still remains faithful to his promises. He comes to Israel, and they're going to hear the good news first. Why? Not because Israel's that great, but because God promised them he would. Because, God, we might say God chooses to start somewhere. God clearly doesn't go the route of, which people, a lot of our world would kind of we'd be more comfortable with. He doesn't go the route of just grabbing everyone's attention all at once and saying, here I am, there's no denying it. That's not how he comes. He comes in weakness in the cross. Again, it's clearly God has a plan, and he's got to, according to the way God does it, he's got to start somewhere, and Israel is the somewhere he starts. He started with Abraham's family, and he's going to be faithful to his promise to folks like Abraham and David, even though, Abraham and David, even themselves, and then definitely their descendants, did practically everything they could to convince God not to. But again, it begs the question, why not go reveal himself? Why Israel? Why not reveal himself to an impressive civilization like Egypt or Assyria or Babylon? It would seem like it would, from a general perspective of when you think about military or communication, it doesn't seem like this is the wisest choice to go to Israel, a pipsqueak of a nation who never really accomplishes anything very significant, militarily or economically or anything like that. But again, the reason is because God's not trying to impress people, or he's not trying to overwhelm people or overawe them. He's trying to inspire true repentance and trust. And so because the relationship between God and humanity is broken, Yahweh works on this personal level to restore that trust, and he starts with Israel and starts to show his faithfulness, that he's worthy of our trust, because even though Israel's been unfaithful, that doesn't change God's faithfulness. And so he goes to them first. God has a plan, and as we read, think about how long the New and Old Testament you put them together, there's a very long period of God actively working with his people. It's not an instantaneous thing, and that's always helpful and healthy to think about and remember. And I think that's almost always a good thing to remember when we have, which I love questions. I love opportunities to talk about God. I've had plenty, and philosophical wondering, like, what's God doing? I love that. I think it's a great opportunity. But it's always good to remember, as we're dealing with God, that it's not an instantaneous thing. And the answer usually isn't instantaneous either. And the way God works here in the Gospels is not instantaneous. And the way he works in our life is usually not instantaneous either. Now, if you have concern or you're worried or questioning about, is God cruel, or is he fickle, or is he doing something, out of character, like is he inconsistent? Well, that, I think, is something that we can definitely demonstrate is clearly not the case as we look. The more I look at, the Bible as a whole, I just really think we've got a great case. Just not from just because we're supposed to believe it. I think there's a really great case that God is not fickle. He's not inconsistent. He's not cruel. And I think it can clearly be demonstrated. Now, notice I didn't say it can quickly be demonstrated. Unless you're willing to engage with the Lord and listen for a little while. If you just want a quick answer, a lot of times there isn't one. But I think it can be shown that God is compassionate, faithful, and purposeful, and I'd be happy to argue on any sort of minutia or a small detail. How does this work? Because I think it does. God clearly does have a plan, and it's not inconsistent. And even this part of Jesus' plan, it may seem odd at first glance, but it is consistent with the larger picture we have painted in Matthew's gospel, or again, it's consistent with the Old Testament stuff, and it's also consistent with what happens in the New Testament and the New Testament church. Now again, if you don't like the plan, if you simply don't like what he's doing, which is often the case, we don't, even when we understand the cross, we may decide that we don't really like it, okay, God, I guess God could do it that way, but I don't want to have something to do with a God who does it like this, or I don't want to wait. I got nothing that's tough cookies, I guess. There's nothing else to say if you don't like it. Again, it's the instructions as Jesus is sending out his apostles. And right here, it's only the 12. Other times he'll send others. But here he just sends out the 12, and he teaches the sorts of things. We have to be a little careful when applying this, because it clearly is to the 12. We can't just lift the text and say, okay, this is what we ought to do, because it's clearly given to Jesus. Jesus given to the 12 apostles, and these 12 apostles are noteworthy. Their names are recorded, and my name's not one of the 12 names. I'm clearly not an apostle like they are. But on the other hand, in some cases, about all we know is their name. Some of them we know more, but some we really don't know much but the name, because they are important. But they're not important on their own, but because of what it is that they are doing and who it is who sends them. That's, the name apostle means sent one. And that's what makes them important, is the one who sends them and what they're sent to do. And again, some of Jesus' instructions are clearly just to them, not to everybody, because Jesus has plenty of disciples at this point. He doesn't send every disciple on this mission. He just sends the 12. And he tells them to go only to the Israelites. He says not to go to the Gentiles. Although that's going to, it's one of these cases where it looks, if you just were to put these two statements by themselves out of context, it looks like they're contradicting themselves, because here Jesus says, don't go to Samaria. Later at the end of Matthew's gospel, same book, same author, he's going to say, go, you will be my witnesses in Judea and Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So this is one of those cases where it's when, the context matters. And, God is not inconsistent. It's not inconsistent for me on Tuesday to say, don't buy any, or my wife to tell me, don't buy any milk. We got plenty. But then a week later says, buy as much milk as we can fit in the refrigerator. My wife's not lying. She's not being inconsistent, but she's, I'm definitely not accusing my wife of lying, just for the record. But she's not. That's just a different scenario, and that's what happens here. At this point, at this phase, it's just to the Israelites. Later, it's going to be, let it fly, go loose, go wild, go crazy. Apostles go everywhere. But I think we still can take a lot we can see the kind of ministry that Jesus wants and the kinds of things, the way this kingdom, sort of generically is going to look. As Jesus sends the apostles out, when we touch on this a little bit, they will not always be welcomed. They'll be welcomed by some folks, but others are going to reject them. And some people are going to feed them and lodge them, and others aren't going to give them any food or lodging. And how Jesus talks about judgment, how the way they will be judged really is dependent on how they judge, how these people receive or judge the apostles, and the one who sends the message and the kingdom is going to end up, they're making, in a sense, you might say, they are making their own judgment, their own actions and their willingness to hear this message are the judgment itself. Because if they determine that the coming kingdom of God is coming specifically through the teachings and actions and apostles of Jesus is worthy of being accepted, trusted, and supported, then they'll come out on the right side of judgment. On the other hand, if they deem that these words and apostles of Jesus are not worthy of their time or support, neither will they be welcomed when it comes to the last day. Jesus tells them that they are to go out and to be, a nice phrase here, wise as serpent but innocent as doves. What does that mean? Well, he's talking to them about, especially in particular, going before leaders. And I think this innocence is not the same thing as, I can never pronounce this word right, but naivete or whatever, being naive. That's not what being innocent as doves means. It's really more about, I like the phrase I read in one of the commentaries by Professor Gibbs, a trusting willingness. So they are willing to trust in God's words, but they're not going in with their eyes blind. They are to be shrewd, because especially as they go before, others, and especially before leaders, they are to be shrewd because they shouldn't fall into the traps of such leaders, but rather they rely on the promises and words of Christ, even though there may be, knowing full well that there may be rejection, there may be even, these apostles may very well be rejected or arrested. They are not, again, they are supposed to be innocent, so they are not supposed to be sent out as like rebels sticking their middle finger to the authorities of all the authorities of the world, and just, they're not. They will be disruptive, but that's because of the gospel. They're not sent to be disruptors. They're not intentionally being disrupting. It's just that by sharing the gospel, it will be disruptive. But it's kind of reminiscent, or it foreshadows what Peter and others are going to say later, and Paul and Peter. Like, they want people to focus on the message, and so as much as it's within their capability, they try to be, Paul says, to be servants and friends of all. Peter says, don't disobey the law, because you don't want to get in trouble for the wrong sort of thing. You're going to get in trouble, but make sure everyone knows why it is. It's not because you're being a jerk or, being, a terrible person or a bad citizen necessarily, but simply because you're doing, it's because of the gospel, and where the gospel doesn't fit in. Again, they're not supposed to fall into the traps, because when they talk to rulers and when they're brought on trial and when the gospel is challenged, there's going to be trappings, you might say, that the rulers will, reasons why the rulers will ways they'll try to convince them, or even, we might say, tempt them, but they are not to fall prey to those. It may not sound all that impressive or earth-shattering what they're doing, but it will be. What the character of the gospel and the fact that it's a real thing, it's not just a teaching, but the apostles are asking, this is an action thing. They are going out and doing something, and they are, in a sense, forcing the world to to make a decision, you might say. Maybe it's not exactly the right way to put it, but the world has to decide one way or the other, the Israelites here, I should say, what they're going to do with this message. It's not the gospel has probably been either wrongly preached or wrongly heard if people think it's just a thing you either believe or don't believe. There are clear consequences. There are clear things that if you believe, that must change, that must be different. And if you just think it's a philosophical or just a religious teaching, then again, either the gospel has not been clearly proclaimed or you have not heard it clearly, because it has bearing on our life. It requires something. It demands something about the world because we are out of whack, because we are sinners, and something, the gospel is good and something has got to give. And so, that's where, it's going to conflict sometimes with family, and even as Jesus talks about that. And it's a good reminder that we need to give Christ priority, and there's lots of things that shape our lives. A lot of it, like family shapes a lot of how we think about things and how we react. But, the gospel will sometimes conflict with how our family does things or how we think about things. And we have to make sure that we give priority to Christ, and that we clearly hear his words. That gospel message still comes to us today and still makes demands of us and teaches us to live in a different sort of way with a different set of criteria, a different goal, different, if you want to say, things that we are after as Christians. And again, we'll continue to see some of that contrast next week when we come back with Bible Bits, chapter Matthew 11.